Perhaps the most restrictive country in the last year and a half is one that has consistently ranked among the freest, the safest, and the best economies in the world. That country is Australia. And a lot of people are now asking, how much longer before Australia can't even be called a free country? Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson. This is Nomad Capitalist. We're the channel and the company that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best, from lower taxes to more personal freedom. That's our thing here. And I just figured ever since a couple months ago, when I started picking on Australia for not letting their own citizens come back to the country, I said, they're probably never letting me into Australia ever again. I figured, why not just keep going with it? Here's an article from The Atlantic that says Australia traded away too much liberty, asking how long can a democracy maintain emergency restrictions and still call itself a free country? It's a good question. This by Connor Friedersdorf, and it goes like this. In a bid to keep the coronavirus out of the country, Australia's federal and state governments imposed draconian restrictions on its citizens. Prime Minister Scott Morrison knows that the burden is too heavy. This is not a sustainable way to live in this country, he recently declared. One prominent civil libertarian summed up the rules by lamenting, "We've never seen anything like this in our lifetimes." That's the kind of thing you hear people saying before they should be running for the exits. But as I've always said, better to leave years too early than a day too late. Have your second residence, have your second passport, have your home, have a ticket out, and be out before things come crashing to a halt. Why do I say that? Because just as we've seen sometimes where we've had 6 weeks before a new tax law passes and goes into effect, you've had days or even weeks when some of these movement restrictions come into place. And if you don't have that stuff set up, you may not be able to move, or you may just not just be psychologically prepared to move. It's a lot easier to say, hey, yeah, we know we have the house in Kathmandu, and we have the residence permit, and they'll let us in, no problem. Let's just go now, before things get too bad. A lot of people in Australia didn't think that way, and I was talking to Australians. I've been talking to them for 6 or 7 years. Very few Australians up until recently ever thought they needed a second citizenship. It was all about, how do I get second residence and tax residence to reduce my taxes? That's great, but if you're stuck in Australia right now, it doesn't do you much good. Up until now, one of the Earth's freest societies, Australia has become a hermit continent. How long can a country maintain emergency restrictions on its citizens' lives while still calling itself a liberal democracy? Australia has been testing the limits. This is the words of the author. It's worth talking about. Before 2020, the idea of Australia all but forbidding its citizens from leaving the country, a restriction associated with communist regimes, was unthinkable. Today, it's a widely accepted policy, and even in our audience, when I made the video saying, how is it that Australia, one of the world's allegedly most liberal societies, always ranks in the most free column on economies? Everyone I know who does business in Australia says this place is a nightmare to do business. Waiters are insane, costs are insane, taxes are insane, just bad regulatory climate in general. But somehow it ranks in the top, even on the Heritage Foundation Economic Freedom Index. And yet, they've basically been acting like a communist country. And even our audience was saying, well, Andrew, this is an exceptional circumstance, so what if they don't let their citizens back in? They knew the rules. Well, that defeats the very purpose of citizenship. What's the purpose of having lived there and paid taxes your entire life, being born there or being naturalized there? What do you get in exchange for that so-called social contract? It's not just me saying that. It's a rather leftist group called the United Nations that proposed that originally. Australia doesn't agree. Even some people in our audience, they're with Australia on this. Hey, keep our own citizens out. Australia's borders, here's the quote, Australia's borders are currently closed and international travel from Australia remains strictly controlled to help prevent the spread of COVID-19, a government website declares. I understand reputational issues. I don't know how many countries are going to, what are they going to do to Australia? I mean, if you leave Australia and go somewhere else, I don't exactly know, how is that Australia's problem? The other countries may not want you. They have their own restrictions. I never understood why Australia had this, but okay, fine. International travel from Australia is only available if you are exempt or if you've been granted an individual exemption, like living in a Soviet, hidden city. The rule was enforced, despite assurances on another government website, dedicated to setting forth Australia's human rights treaty obligations, that the freedom to leave a country cannot be made dependent on establishing a purpose or reason for leaving. That's correct. That's basically the basis for international law. A citizen can leave his country and he can return to his country, and Australia has stopped both of those while maintaining its reputation somehow as a free country. The nation's high court struck down a challenge. If you think the courts will save you, pay attention. People always say, oh, don't worry, the Supreme Court will step in. Struck down a challenge to the country's COVID-19 restrictions. It may be accepted that the travel restrictions are harsh. It may also be accepted that they intrude upon individual rights, it ruled. But who cares, right? But the Parliament was aware of that. So as long as Parliament, as long as Congress knows they're screwing you, as long as they know they're violating your rights, as long as they know they're going against the very basic human rights that are established by every country on earth, then it's fine. Until last month, Australians who are residents of foreign countries were exempt from the rule so they could return to their residence, but the government tightened restrictions further, trapping many of them in the country too. And then we saw an article recently where they said even some foreigners will be trapped in the country. You're not even their citizen and they're going to force you to stay there. Interstate travel, the article continues, within Australia is also severely restricted, and the government of South Australia, one of the country's 6 states, have a good friend down there, developed and is now testing an app, here's the words of the author, as Orwellian as any in the free world to enforce its quarantine rules. Basically, they have an app and they just send you a thing every 15 minutes, you got to send them a picture. I think every South Australian should feel pretty good that we're the national pilot for this app. That's from the Premier of South Australia, Stephen Marshall. Other states also curtailed their citizens' liberty in the name of safety. The state of Victoria announced a curfew and suspended its parliament for key parts of the pandemic. To put this in context, federal and state parliaments sat during both world wars and the Spanish flu when curfews had never been imposed, the scholar John Lee observed in an article for the Brookings Institution. In responding to a question about whether they'd gone too far with respect to imposing a curfew, avoiding the question of why a curfew was needed when no other state had one, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews replied, it's not about human rights, it's about human life. Now, I understand we have a pandemic. And the article continues, New South Wales, almost every part of Australia has had a problem, and they keep going back and forth to these various lockdowns. The article does say, Australia is undoubtedly a democracy with multiple political parties, regular elections, and a peaceful transfer of power. But if a country indefinitely forbids its citizens from leaving its borders, strands tens of thousands of its citizens abroad, puts strict rules on interstate travel, prohibits citizens from leaving home without an excuse from an official government list, mandates all kinds of other mandates, deploys the military to enforce the rules, bans protests, arrests and fines dissenters, is this country still a liberal democracy? Enduring rules of that sort certainly would render a country to be a police state. Now, for some reason, if it's a Western country, part of the legacy brands, right? We call them the legacy brands. Why? Because they've been at one time bastions of freedom. They've burnished reputation the same way people think fondly to the time when Louis Vuitton made some of the world's finest trunks. You would sail on the Titanic with your Louis Vuitton trunk. These are legacy brand countries, and you're not allowed to say anything bad about the legacy brand countries. Now, if some other country did this, this reminds me of what happens. The United States has citizenship-based taxation. No matter where you live, you can reduce your taxes. We help people do it all the time, but you're still subject to U.S. tax law. And essentially, there are certain countries where you have to leave. You got to go to a certain country for a couple of years. There's certain conditions, but just flat-out citizenship-based taxation. The only other country that does that, essentially, is Eritrea, and only they impose a small tax of like 2% on your earnings. Okay. Now, countries like Canada went to the United Nations and condemned Eritrea. How dare you do this to your citizens? Who's saying that against the United States? Absolutely nobody. Legacy brands can get away with whatever they want. Why? Because there's this idea it's a liberal democracy, and the argument right now, again, I understand we have a pandemic, and I'm sure I'm probably a little bit too much in the middle for some people watching this, right? But when you're restricting people's freedom to come and leave their own country, when you're forcing people to not leave a 5-kilometer radius, when you have the military out in the streets, when you forbid protest. I mean, these are the kind of things that people in Australia would say, "Oh, I'm not going to move to Dubai. I'm not going to move to Singapore." You know, you can't have a protest and jump up and down and scream and yell, as if that was ever the reason to move to those countries, because you wanted to change their political system, right? You were going there because it was a nice place to live, nice consumer conveniences, good tax policy, you have a nice life, and you can leave countries like Australia behind. And yet now you can't protest in Australia. The democracy is falling apart, and it's temporary. Oh, it's an emergency. Well, how many times have we heard that before? And you look back, you recently had the 20th anniversary of 9/11. You're still at the airport taking your shoes off, aren't you? Now, I'm not, because I'm going through airports where they have a little bit of sanity still left. Okay, you can't take your giant hair mousse or your giant perfume on the plane with you anymore. That's pretty international. But at least there's some sanity in the places where I'm flying through. But if you're in the U.S., if you're in Australia, you're going through the big scanners, you're putting your shoes off, you're emptying every coin from your pocket, and that hasn't changed. It has become Orwellian in the last 20 years, and it wasn't temporary. It wasn't, oh, we got to defeat the terrorists. Well, they had 20 years, and look what just happened. They just cut and run. They failed. And so, as if this is going to be any different, this is going to be, oh, don't worry, it's a year and a half. Do you think that once a country says, you're our citizen, you can't come back, I do think some of the provisions will be temporary. I don't think every single thing they're doing. People are looking, because you're looking at the pandemic as, some people are looking at this as like, oh, a country made me wear a mask. It's off my list forever. Listen, there can be some rules for a certain situation. Not everyone will agree with me on that, but I refuse just to give up because a country said, hey, when you go into the store, can you wear a mask? For some period of months. But when Australia, the most aggressive things in terms of you can't come back to the country. Who knows what they come up with next? And as long as they have the veneer of we're a liberal democracy, we're a legacy brand, we're one of the most free countries in the world, the article asks a good question. How long do they get to keep doing the exact opposite and maintain that veneer? Well, if history is any guide, I would say quite a long time. Because how long have we seen the United States, for example, slipping in economic freedom rankings? Georgia, Chile, other post-communist countries are now beating it in the rankings. Countries that in your lifetime were communist countries are beating the United States of America in economic freedom. Countries that are hailed as socialist dumps, like Denmark, are beating the United States in economic freedom. Now, again, these indexes are not perfect. I mean, after all, they're the same ones that put Australia high on the list. But, people still say, the U.S., best place to invest. Well, not according to the statistics. Australia, best place to live? Yes, if you live in Australia, I suppose. And again, even some people in our audience, which are supposed to be more freedom-minded, libertarian, are saying, hey, Andrew, again, why does this matter? Well, it matters because, again, like to me, yes, emergency. All right, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever. Is that ideal? No. But these guys are really dragging it out to where the world has reopened. I mean, you have entire countries. You go to Mexico, you go to Colombia right now. They don't even want to test to get in, right? And yet Australia, they say you can't go 5 kilometers. Which grocery store are you going to? This is not where the world is at right now. They are one of the most illiberal places in the world, and yet people will defend it. The courts, you think the courts are going to save you? I've told you time and time and time again, the courts are not going to come and save you. Private businesses are not going to come and save you. If you're in a country like this, it's a problem. Now, has there been any perfect country? Maybe not. But I would rather have a handful of places to pick from, and I would at least know what I'm getting into. I would at least rather have a country where they don't have the luxury of printing out currency because they actually have to run a proper economy, right? If they do that, they're gonna fall off a cliff, just printing money and letting everybody sit at home. Australia's had a few too many luxuries, and they've taken advantage of that to become one of the most oppressive countries in the world. This is what, beyond just financial reasons, you want a residence permit. Potentially, after you've been living in Australia, you want to leave and go and live in another country. You want to go and live in one of your residence permits countries. You want to have a second citizenship because if they can stop you from coming and going, imagine what else they can do. If you don't do this, that, or the other, we're not going to renew your passport. I mean, who knows what's next? This is why residence and citizenship are important. It goes beyond taxes. Now, if you're stuck in Australia, you're stuck paying their taxes. And what are you getting for it? You're getting a swift kick in the tuchus in terms of your freedoms. But beyond the financial, you want to have, I think, more than a plan B. You want to have a plan A that as soon as you can leave, you've got a place to go where they were not nearly as restrictive, and at least there was some veneer of an emergency, whereas Australia, which has been dragging out for over a year and a half now. Don't stop now. We've got well over 1,000 more videos here on YouTube for you to watch and learn how to go where you're treated best. And if you want to work with Nomad Capitalist personally, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply, learn about our unique, tried and true process, garnered over years of experience, and learn how you can become our client.